continuing the thesis part of the introduction. It's going to be question we'll be answering today. It's going to follow the similar structure. The delta part is in the red. So the question is its sovereignty through its causality manifesting glory. As you can imagine, this is focused on the glory alone part of the 5 solos. So that is the difference. If that is the means by which all the covenants and dispensations are being executed by Christ alone, and within quotes, the argument is, why not study scripture using the sovereignty lens? So now that we are kind of structuring the questions in the similar type of format, I'm sure you're used to the type of the study. So hopefully this should go a little more quickly than the previous studies, I'm thinking. In any case, as we always do, we do a kind of a quick or historical recap in case someone listened to the study at a later point in time. So as part of that, if I may quickly go back to the first study way back in the beginning of the year. We started a new study, rather a new framework called integrated sovereignism, by shifting the lenses from the degree of perceptional discontinuity and progressivity to sovereignty. And an idea was surveying all the major worldviews, obviously with a focus on Judaic Christian worldview. And then we kind of took an approach, why do we need a kind of a new framework? So the first question we started was, why do we need a dynamic framework that models scriptural reality as accurately as possible? And then we went through a structured approach or survey approach to answer that question. Kind of brought us back to the second question, which is covenantalism and dispensationalism are the two sides of the same coin. Why not study scripture sovereignty lens? Again, we went through a structured approach. And the third question was, if covenants and dispensations are the cause and effect within sovereignty, why not study scripture sovereignty lens? And then kind of went through the structured approach and brought us back to the fourth question. Again, this is more of a sovereignty is more of a source of the scripture. Why not study in the sovereignty lens? And then, which brought us back to the fifth question, which is if sovereignty is the source of salvation, the foundation doctrine. And within parentheses, we put a 5 solos. Why not study scripture and everything using sovereignty lens? So that kind of helped us to pivot into the second part of the introduction. In the sense, the first 5 questions were structure part of the introduction. And then the second 5 solos, more of a thesis part of the introduction. So which kind of brought us back to question number 6. Again, in this question, we kind of took the first solo, Christ alone, and then we kind of phrased the question, if sovereignty through its causality is the means by which Christ executed all the covenants and dispensation, why not study scripture sovereignty lens? And then we went through a structured approach in study 7. And then we kind of qualified the causality using grace alone. So the delta part is through its causality causing gracious pull is the means. Why not study scripture using the sovereignty lens? And then which kind of took us back to study number 8. And again, we kind of qualified the same causality part using the faith part. And then rest of the argument remained the same. And then we went through the structured approach, which has brought us back to today's study. Again, the delta part is sovereignty through its causality manifesting glory is the means by which all the covenants and dispensations are executed by Christ alone. Why not study scripture using the sovereignty lens? So kind of we are going to continue the similar type of structure to answer this question also. As always, especially the thesis part or the means part of the structure. I think, as you might recall, we had used another metaphor in a way to kind of make sure the five solos arguments are structured in a way to complement each other or strengthening each other's argument. I think this is something we had already gone into the details in the couple of sessions before. So I'm not going to go into argument by argument today, although I just want you to remember just the five arguments are listed in the left-hand side, and then they are mapped metaphorically to the planetary or star motion picture, which we are very familiar with. I'm sure we all know that. So within part of that, I think if you might remember, the faith alone, grace alone, and glory alone are respectively mapped to those three parts of the picture, as you can see in the green arrows, and they are anchored using our sovereignty five-part equation from scripture alone. And then, as we all agreed, Christ alone is the leader of the five solos, is continue to execute them as we speak. So as part of that, now that we have finished three solos, I think the logical progression or pivoting point today is going to be the glory alone. Or thing, the difference, I think this is something, one of the things maybe as we have all heard this five solos. So one of the kind of the temptation for us to see glory is it is like faith and grace, right? So see, always by grace through faith for his glory alone. So there's a subtle difference. I just want you to make sure when the Reformations, when the Reformers, Luther, Calvin, everybody else were setting the arguments for the five solos, they kind of established in such a way it is by grace through faith for his glory alone. Obviously, by Christ alone was leading the whole thing, and then scripture alone is the foundation. So that is the kind of the difference. What does that mean? So as part of that, I think that is the kind of going to be the first question we need to kind of understand, the difference between grace and faith and glory. Okay, so which I'll come back to that point, but then before getting to this part, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to the complementary part of the argument. I think now that we have gone through that in the previous study, so let me just to point out it, and then I'm not going to go into the details part. So that said, so coming back to today's session, as we always start from this beautiful verse from Isaiah 44:7, why we need to study scripture using this structured approach. This is the kind of the verse rhetorically challenging us to go through this five-part structure. That is something I just want to make sure is always on the top of our head. As part of that, as always, we do a little bit of a definitions. I think kind of the definitions tweaking to the context of the question. Again, we are not changing the definitions part, just to make sure we're tweaking the definition within the context of the question we'll be answering. So part of that you can see. The delta part, I put that as covenants are always the cause, the conditional cause part we always know. The dispensations is the effect we have raised. So the delta part here is the causality manifesting glory as the means. I think that is the only difference. Similarly, on the flip side, is a causality, I mean, the effect side is the same thing manifesting. So this is a similar type of the argument, and then we're going to go through a two-part structure. We had used a three-part structure in the last session, so we're going to go through kind of the two-part structure to answer this question today, which is kind of bringing us back to the sovereignty of God, or you can call that even a causal chain part of the dimension. The question, I think, remember the subtle difference I pointed out between grace and faith versus glory. So remember, the glory is not by glory. It is for his glory. So you can see that is a subtle difference. So that is what we are going to kind of make sure we understand that part by answering this question before going into our regular root causal chain to prove the glory part. So the question is, the first question we got to understand is, what is the number one purpose of the whole sovereign blueprint or sovereignty of God? Okay, or better yet, the number one purpose of all the covenants and dispensations, okay, within the sovereignty of God. Again, we always know the sovereignty of God, the lightning covenant is that is the master covenant, and the breath make is a master dispensation. We had already kind of established it, and everything else were sub-covenants and dispensations. So within the context of it, I just want to make sure the whole purpose of the sovereignty of God, we all know sovereignty existed before time, which is we have already established in multiple study sessions. So the question is, before time, I think, before eternity, the purpose all along, okay, was the worship part or glorifying God part was always the theme. Even going back to the creation of angels, which scripture is not going into a lot of details, but then most of the theologians kind of agree when they put this, teachings from Ezekiel and Isaiah. Definitely, God had experimented with the worship project angels first, and then the failure of the worship practice or the project kind of led to the second experimentation with humanity. Okay, that is one of the common themes in most of the theologians when they look at it from the eternity past to the eternity present, right? So that is the kind of the argument. You might have already heard this, which is not new to any of us. So within the context of that, this worship practice theme has been going all the way back from eternity. So one can argue, okay, the first thing, the purpose of the lightning covenant itself, okay, is to revive the worship practice correctly through humans from the failure of the 1/3 of the angels, which is the number one purpose of the lightning covenant and the breath meat dispensation. So that is kind of the first revival, the worship part, okay? And then, which I don't want to go into all the verses, I think I'll leave it for you to do that. This is a lot of detailed study if you have to build a case for it. But then a lot of theologians have done it. So that's kind of the first revival, the worship practice. The second part, after the failure of Adam, the same worship practice again was restored using redemption. Okay, so that is something you can see from Genesis 3:16, and then Paul comes back and closes the loop in Romans 1:21. So these two are kind of the covenantal revival and covenantal restoration. And then fast forwarding to the Reformation period. So the reformers again, they started reforming the worship practice again correctly to humans from the failure of the traditions. So that is the number one purpose of. So we can see that this is, we can see the Westminster Catechism and the Confession of Faith and everywhere. So the idea here is, one thing if you ask, I'm sure the top of the mind, what is the purpose of Reformation? All of us might think for is to establishing doctrinal purity, right? That is the 5 solas. That's what we'll come back and say. But then when we go deeper, the purpose of Reformation is to establish, reform the worship practice correctly, because the worship which was restored by redemption covenant, and then later again restored by Paul in Romans 1:21, that over a period of historical traditions was not put in practice correctly. That is the reason reformers were establishing the worship practice again. The byproduct was doctrinal purity. So that's a key point. So in other words, all along the historically, all the way from eternity to past to present, the common thread across the sovereignty is always reviving or restoring or reforming the worship practice back on track. And all the doctrines are byproducts of the means by which they're strengthening this worshiping. That is a key point. So that's the reason Reformation is as important as the previous restoration, previous revivals. So when you look at it from that standpoint, this is God's worship project being restored or reformed. And then all the other doctrines have to be in the right place to strengthen the worship practice. That is the key. That's the reason we are saying in the solo, for his glory. So everything we do is always for his glory. That's the point. So that kind of a theme, this is something not new to us. We had already seen that in the earlier Bible study. This worship is work and work is worship, right? All the way back. In fact, I put a detailed study, even a sermon, right? So I'm not going to go into the details part of it. I kind of pulled that picture from one of the earlier studies. So this theme, worship theme, not only from sovereign eternity past, but through the scripture, this worship theme is going across the board. So that's one of the reasons we had even proved worship is work and work is worship. So everything we do, so worship in the glorifying the God in the person of God dimension, or everything else we do, work, is also glorifying God in the principle dimension. A sovereignty of God is basically, it's got two dimensions, person of God and principles of God. Worship in the person of God dimension and work in the principles of God dimension. And that precisely is the reason, the purpose, the mission statement of all the things we're doing is all boils down to the simple statement, worship is work and work is worship. So as you can imagine, this is it. This is the crux of it. So I think I just want all of us to remember this solo is that much more important because this kind of connects us back to our mission state. So that is kind of important point. I just want all of us to remember that. So with that kind of introduction or sub-introduction, so I just want to, let's go back to our standard anchor slide and see how we can prove this solo within the context of our sovereignty point. Again, this is a standard kind of a anchor slide. I know you've been used to this slide, so as always, so we can kind of work through the slide bottom up. So as we all know, the anchor slide is anchored on a kind of the 5-part sovereignty equation at the foundation of it, which is kind of holding it all together. And then I've got a one verse, as I always do, a kind of the verse in the bubble, which is going to be an anchoring verse, which I'll come back to it. And then kind of if you work through the principles part of the statement, I've got two kind of the principles here. And again, this is a kind of the, we've been kind of tweaking the principles similar to how you used to tweak the definitions part as per the question we are answering. So within the context of today's question, the covenant side of the equation, the principle is word becoming flesh. Okay, so this is something we might have already seen even in the Christ alone type of argument, because kind of they are related part. And similarly, on the flip side, the principle here is word becoming glory. Okay, so again, it is all kind of the same thing coming from John 1 through 17. Okay, so this is something we have already kind of established it. I just want you to be aware of it. So similarly, so when we go back to the top portion of the slide. This is a kind of the similar word causal chain we had already used in the previous 2 sessions. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details. So because you already know the word causal chain by now. So we're gonna kind of use the same causal chain also to prove this question or this point or answer this question. So with a subtle difference, that's what I think this different spot only I'll highlight. So as always, saying it is a kind of the answering this question has got a 3 subparts. So as you can see in the red, those are the 3 kind of the questions will be going in a step-by-step manner to answer it, kind of within the context of supporting the solo. As part of that, I think before going to the 3 questions part, the arrow part, okay, so that kind of might give us a clue of how this anchor verse is connected to those 3 subparts of the argument. So as you can see, for Christ, comma, to glorify Father by grace through faith, there must exist a causality causing grace and faith love shape. Glory principles govern sovereignty. So the idea here is if we can somehow prove this statement, it is equivalent to answering those 3 questions, which is equivalent to answering the top part of the question. That's kind of the way I'm structuring the argument today. Again, this is a similar structure we had used in the past, so I'm sure you're all used to it now. So that said, so it might be a good place to start from this anchoring verse from John 17, 4 and 5. So this is a famous statement you might have already, especially during our kind of the Easter time, the Good Friday, the famous 7 sayings of Jesus, right from the cross. Within the context of it, we might have heard this. So I'm not sure how many of us have really understood what Jesus meant here. This is a heavily loaded theology statement. So honestly, all of us, if I might say from my standpoint, I've heard it, but it didn't resonate with me kind of to the depth of a theology within the context of the solo as it got resonated when I was preparing for the study. In other words, I think whenever we search scripture with the focus on something, that is when the scripture speaks to us within the context of that question. So this is something I'm learning every day. Every time you read verse within the context of one lens, now although we kind of called it as a sovereignty lens, but then within sovereignty, when you go with the sub lenses, the beauty of scripture is it always resonates with us in a different light. So that said, so if you look at this, what Jesus is saying is, okay, he's kind of finished the job. Okay, that is a kind of the context. I don't want to go back to the 1, 2, 3, although we'll come back and then he'll kind of say, yes, I kind of done the job, what you asked me to do. And then what Jesus is saying is, Father, I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you have wanted me to do. Okay, so that is, which will come back and connect it back to the 3rd subpart of the question. And then see the 5th verse. And now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. This is the kind of the thing which goes back to the same point. So remember, we already saw grace, faith, Christ, everything, the whole sovereignty blueprint was pre-designed before time. All the places, Paul is the one which comes back and points out it was done in the grace, faith, Christ alone dimensions. But the glory part is the one, only Christ is kind of reminding the Father, okay, within the context of the work he has accomplished. So what does that mean? The point here is, okay, the work itself is the manifestation of his glory. Okay, do you see that work is worship type of a thing? So what Jesus is saying is, I've accomplished the work. Now you glorify me in your own presence, restore to me so that I can share the glory that I had with you before the world existed. So in other words, this was pre-planned in eternity. Okay, all that Jesus did was, as part of the word causal chain, he came into the earth, accomplished it as a work. What was in eternity as a worship, okay, as a glory, came into this earth, and God accomplished as a work. That's the beauty of it. Now Jesus, after finishing it, Jesus is saying, Father, restore me back to worship, back to the glory, which I had already had it with you in eternity past. So it started as a worship, came to earth, and God accomplished it as a work. Now Jesus is saying, let me come back and close the loop, back to worship. So not that I'm trying to prove an argument one more time, worship is work. The beauty of this glory part is Jesus himself is saying, this is a worship work loop. It's all about this. Everything else were just details. This is the crux. So this is what is all the more important, which again goes back to our earlier point. Remember, the worship all the way from the purpose of sovereignty is worship or glory. This is all about glory, glory, glory. So that is a point I think Jesus is closing the argument, closing the book, using worship is work, work is worship argument. So with that kind of introduction, now when we go back and look at those three statements, I'm sure it'll understand, it'll resonate with you much more effectively. The first part of what Jesus Christ is saying, obviously, based on this verse, Christ co-caused the covenants by sharing the glory with Father before time. Okay, that's what I think Jesus is alluding in 17:5. And when you go back to second argument, obviously, Christ conformed to all of it on the cross. Okay, that's what Jesus is saying. I accomplished it. And we have already seen that. Paul also comes back and reenacts the whole argument later in Galatians, Romans, and Corinthians. So what Jesus is saying here is, I have accomplished it. So he confirmed it and then he completed it. So it's kind of easy to see the three parts of the argument. But then the point I want you to remember, empathize, internalize is, this is coming out of the mouth of Jesus. Maybe this point is the crux of it. That's the reason Jesus is saying, as opposed to all the details part, Paul is taking care of it. Whereas Jesus is nailing the crux of it. That's what I'm kind of thinking. Why Paul didn't talk about this point? Maybe because this is the only thing which can be done only by Jesus alone, Christ alone. So it has to come from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So that's the reason I think this for his glory alone argument is that's much more strengthened, which kind of closes the loop of all the arguments, faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone. It is capped by this for his glory alone, which is using John 17:5, and then which kind of manifests as three-part argument we have already seen. Hopefully that kind of resonates with all of you a little more effectively. Again, now that we have seen it, which kind of brings us back to this kind of the part I had put that here. This is something, again, goes back to the earlier point, worship is work, work is worship. In other words, I would even go to this extent of saying, proving for his glory alone, solos equivalent to proving worship is work, because that's what Jesus says. So which goes back to the mission statement, our mission statement. I would even say this is the mission statement of Planet Earth Inc. So for example, again, the revival, restoration, and formation of the three worship practice, okay, all along was the common theme. So if one had to give a mission statement for Planet Earth Inc., if someone had to relaunch Planet Earth as a business or a company or something, I would say the best mission statement for Planet Earth Inc. will be worship is work, work is worship, because that is all it is about. That's one of the reasons, again, this is a sidebar argument I've been saying, purpose of scripture or sovereignty is glorifying God, worship God, not just in the person of God dimension, but also in the principles of God dimension. It is work in all dimensions, all disciplines, whatever else we do. Only when we do it, that completes the scripture. That's the reason I've been saying all along, we need another affirmation. Until and unless we do it, we are not completing the scripture. Okay? I think, again, with all humility, somehow in the earlier point in church history, I think we started doing it as a two-track. That is the reason the world is filled with so much of problems. The way to solve this is integrating the two tracks together with this mission statement: worship is work and work is worship. So again, that is the argument for another day. I think that is the crux of this point, which kind of brings us back to our summary. Again, this is something we already talked about it. So that's the reason I kind of said this is a sidebar point, which kind of brings us back to our summary. And now we want to kind of take another 10 or 15 minutes for the kind of the opening floor for Q&A. So if I have to kind of wrap up and summarize the argument, again, this is a very thought. Again, I don't want to go into a lot of the details since we've already very familiar with it. So if you go back to the red part, which is there, basically the argument here is Christ co-caused the covenant by sharing the glory with the Father. Again, as we pointed out in John 17:5, and then Christ confirmed to the covenant by finishing the work on the cross, and then Christ completed it, and there entered the argument. There he completed the job, okay, for his glory alone. So hopefully that gives us a compelling reason, I think, why this solo, in a way, proves our argument all the more, because this is the glory part is part and parcel of the sovereignty. In other words, the purpose of sovereignty itself is to glorify God. So this solo part is a kind of its sovereignty is the source. Glory is the kind of the means by which the sovereignty is kind of manifesting in this world today. Okay, that is kind of that much this, I think the solo in my mind is important. Hopefully that argument has resonated with all of you. So that, I think what I want to do is, let's see if we can open up the floor and see if you have some Q&A, and then we can go from there.